Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to Sven and organizers. It's been a really fun thing to sit here and hear so many perspectives on reasonableness. I work in epistemology and a little bit in the philosophy of language. And so where I'm coming from, I've been working for quite a few years now trying to make sense of the semantics and the pragmatics of knowledge claims. And so in this talk, I think I'll just spend a little time giving you a bit of background about where I come from. My focus is on relevance in a theoretical sense and as it's used in epistemology and theories of knowledge. So I want to explain that a bit. The title, by the way, does that sound familiar to anybody? So Rawls has, justice as fairness, political, not metaphysical. And I thought I liked that echo because fairness he understands as reasonableness, right? So beyond that, I don't go into Rawls. That's just a little taste for you. Not here, anyway. Okay, much of what we take ourselves to know in the empirical realm, anyway, is based on less than absolutely conclusive reasons. Where by conclusive, I mean reasons such that one could never have evidence that shows those reasons to be misleading or bad. That's one thing one can mean, anyway. So, we know the global climate is getting warmer. We know this now. Now it's just a matter of what and how fast and understanding the mechanisms a little bit, but we know that the climate is changing and it's getting warmer. We know this on the basis of a lot of very good evidence, but it is less than conclusive in the sense that, now I'll change the formulation a little bit, we could have all of this evidence and yet our twins on a different world could have all the same evidence, and yet there could be an unknown source of heat on that other planet, in that other possible world, let's say, instead of planet, another possible world. So it's consistent with our evidence that there is some other source of global warming. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean that we don't know the climate is getting warmer because of, all the reasons we have for thinking that's true. Okay? This is a kind of fallibilism. This is a way of making precise what fallibilism consists in. You can know on the strength of evidence that is less than conclusive. Okay? Your evidential twin could go wrong and have a false belief. Okay? One way of articulating this kind of fallibilist approach. How do I change slides, Sven? I haven't used this. I'm an Apple person. They have arrows with apples too. Okay, good. It worked. One way to articulate fallibilism is through a relevant alternatives approach to knowledge. And I call it an approach because there are actually many different kinds of relevant alternatives theories. You can have different views about what relevance is. You can have different views about what alternatives are. Relevant alternatives approaches to knowledge basically say you can know a proposition P, an empirical proposition, on the strength of some evidence as long as that evidence is sufficient to rule out all the relevant defeaters to P. You don't have to rule out all of them. So that's one way of becoming more specific about what it is to be a fallibilist. Okay. I'm very attracted to this approach. Keith DeRose at some point says, yeah, it's so intuitive. Everybody loves it, but it's false. Well, I think it is intuitive. It gets at something, I think, deep about the way we think about knowledge. So I'm inclined to articulate a specific kind of relevant alternatives approach to knowledge. But problem, what makes an alternative relevant? This has been a problem for relevant alternatives theorists. You can actually read the last, say, 50 years of epistemology, a certain strand of analytic epistemology, and it's just attempt after attempt to state some condition of relevance. So it's not for want of trying that theorists haven't come up with a satisfactory account just yet. I would be inclined, in fact, to suggest, if you're interested in a safety theory of knowledge or a sensitivity theory of knowledge, some sort of modal account of knowledge, you're participating in this effort to find an account of relevance as well. Reaching out to the nearest world where not P and saying, okay, you don't know P if the nearest world to you is a not P world or something. That's a way of giving an account of relevant alternatives that you haven't yet eliminated. Okay, we can talk more about that. Ernest Sosa famously, this is, I think, I've forgotten the date now, 1996 or something. What makes an alternative relevant? No answer is generally accepted, even among relevantists, and the notion of relevance remains obscure. No published account having yet much relieved this darkness. That makes it sound like, we're utterly in the dark about what relevance is as such. It's not really the case. I think that there's just a lot of disagreement, but I don't expect relevance theorists to disagree radically with this estimate. Well, one thinker's debilitating drawback is another's challenging open problem to be resolved in due course. So I'm on the optimistic side that says, yes, this is a problem we can resolve in due course. I don't think Ernest Sosa agrees, but I'll wait on that 1 second. So, excuse me. I should have been keeping time. When did we start?
So I still have 35 minutes.
I still have 35, so I've been going for about 10 already. No kidding. Time warp. Okay, I'll start my timer now. Where to go? All right, I'll speed up. The problem of relevance I want to suggest is what makes an alternative relevant? We've seen a history of examples of efforts to state in so many terms what makes an alternative relevant. Fred Dretske says, imagine a sphere of possible worlds, aligned by metaphysical similarity. An alternative is relevant if it's consistent with P's falsity in a nearby world, something like that. So that's just one example, and there are counterexamples to this, not surprisingly, right? It's just almost like the Gettier problem is a history of sort of proposed accounts of relevance and then the search for counterexamples, and lo, you can discover them. And so at a certain point you could just think, well, relevance, it's just not the right way to be thinking about knowledge at all. I'm more optimistic than that. I think what it shows, this history of counterexampling, is that the idea of relevance is not codifiable. And that is a very familiar idea in the philosophy of law. That rules themselves can only codify so much. And that you can state a rule, but you'll always need to keep articulating how it applies in a particular circumstance. It's very familiar. H.L.A. Hart, this is from the Concept of Law, he says, sometimes the sphere to be legally controlled is recognized as one in which the features of individual cases will vary so much. Okay, the features of individual cases vary so much in socially important but unpredictable respects that uniform rules to be applied from case to case without further official direction cannot usefully be framed by legislatures in advance. So there's this idea that rules will get you so far, but you're always going to need to interpret them further. Actually, Hart, I think, thinks of this he also calls it the open texture of the law. He thinks of it as a positive feature because then you get to interpret the law further, right? So, no wheeled vehicles in the park. That's a rule. Does somebody pushing a baby pram count? That's a wheeled vehicle. Oh, wait a minute. We didn't mean to apply it to that case, right? We need to interpret this no wheeled vehicles rule so that we get its application sensibly, so that we treat the cases the way we want to. The non-codifiability of relevance, I think, is an okay kind of moral to draw. It's like, its diagnoses are failures in the last 50 years to come up with an account of relevance. And it also, I think, opens the door to a certain kind of alternative way of theorizing about the matter. In my book, Assurance, which is now 5 years old, I think, yeah. I suggest that we can think about relevance instead as a matter of reasonableness. Okay. Here's a standard kind of story about knowledge told in relevant-y kinds of terms. I cast it in terms of a knowledge claim. So, as uttered by speaker X, S knows P is true in a situation K. That means that P is true, right? S believes P, and S has evidence sufficient to eliminate all the alternatives to P that a reasonable person with X's perspective on the situation K would want eliminated before going ahead and assuring somebody else that P is true. Where assuring is a distinctive sort of speech act. Okay. This is the rough idea, right? It's a relevant alternatives account of knowledge buried in there. And the criterion, how much evidence do you need before you know something? You need enough evidence to eliminate all the relevant alternatives. What's a relevant alternative? It's an alternative a reasonable person would want eliminated. What's a reasonable person? Well, you know, there's a reasonable person standard we use, we judge people by. We judge people by it when it matters a whole lot more, in fact, than, you know, judging whether somebody's knowledge claim about where the strike is today or the train, when the train leaves, you know, matters, right? We actually judge people by a reasonable person standard in courts of law, and we take away their rights or we punish them, right? So we make use of this reasonable person standard already in this going concern we have, the legal setting. So I thought, yeah, I can use it here. It's a forensic standard. It's a social forensic standard of responsibility. It's not a metaphysical standard of nearness of worlds, right? But we already sort of have some sense of what reasonableness is, don't we? And then, so I got very excited about this. This is a cool idea. And it also makes sense of some things that J.L. Austin says. He never talks about the reasonable person standard. He talks about making sure your challenges are within reason to knowledge claims. You know, make sure that you only ask, enough is enough. You should only ask people to defend their knowledge claims against reason, you know, alternatives that are within the bounds of reason. So I thought it made sense of some things Austin said as well. And it's, you know, is it codifiable? What's reasonable? No. But that's okay. Codifiability, being able to say in so many words precisely what reasonableness requires, is not what we expect. That's okay too. So I was very excited about this. I anticipated a lot of stern looks from colleagues, and I got them. Allowing this practical thing to have this practical sounding thing to have a role in an account of knowledge. We can talk more about this. I think this is still consistent with thinking of knowledge as a purely intellectualist kind of property. Okay, the story about reasonableness here is setting a standard of how much evidence, but there's still only evidence that is, you know, that makes you know, right? Evidence, true belief are still components of knowledge. Okay, excuse me. So that's the background. That's where I'm coming from. What the heck is the reasonable person standard, though? I thought, well, I have leave next year. I'll figure it out. I'll read a lot of law and sit in a tort law class. And surely some clever jurisprudent theorist has come up with an account of the reasonable person standard and what its content is. I was very naive. These are some questions I have going in. You know, is there a procedure for generating answers to the question of what the reasonable person standard demands? If there is a procedure, what is it? If there's not a procedure, how else might we manage to communicate our knowledge claims? I take it as a given that we do communicate true and false claims when we claim to know things, and we manage to understand each other. That's also background, where I come from. Well, if there's no procedure for determining what's a reasonable alternative, what's a relevant alternative, then there's no procedure for saying, oh, this claim is true, this knowledge claim is true, this knowledge claim is false. If there's no procedure, then how do we understand each other? Is there, in fact, a single determinate answer to the question of what the reasonable person standard demands? in the way of relevance, again, in any particular case? And is the standard relative in some sense to subjects or communities, and so possibly even encodes biases? And then what my account of knowledge is suggesting is that biased people can know things on the basis and strength of their bias. Is that okay or not? So I threw a lot of questions at myself that I assumed angry and unhappy people might throw at me, and these are stated in less unhappy ways, but I think they're still good questions. Sorry about the bad, this was done late last night. I want to throw out the first question in a way, because I don't think reasonableness is codifiable. So to ask what the procedure is for finding it is to misunderstand that you invoke the reasonable person standard in the face of a failure to be able to codify relevance. Okay, but these are good questions, and I think we can add another one in place of the question about whether there's a procedure and what it is, with a question about what it is about us as human beings that makes it possible for us to coordinate our knowledge ascribing practice as if we were observing this standard. I'd like to understand that. What is it about us that makes this something we can do? So I read some tort law. I read a lot of tort law, and I read this brilliant intellectual history of tort law in America by G.E. White. I highly recommend it. It's, at various times I've been like, wow, I'm really excited by the history of tort law. This is getting funny. Okay. Tort law is all about negligence, trying to hold people to standards of behavior even when they're not performing criminal actions against each other. This is not criminal law. This is just ordinary hurting each other in ways that, we don't like, or creating costs for people. And the central idea that tort law in Anglophone countries uses anyway. I've recently discovered that there's some echo of this in French, Italian, and German law, that reasonableness is a standard of negligence in these other legal systems as well, but mostly I'm familiar with Anglophone legal systems. The idea is that negligent behavior is behavior that a reasonable person would not have undertaken. Okay. Negligent behavior is characterized by a failure to be reasonable or meet a reasonable person's standard. And at that point, you can become liable for damages. And a lot of theory of tort law looks for a foundation of, a theory of what reasonableness is or what negligence consists in moral terms or some sort of social political terms. So there's, you can look and find Kantian saying, yes, reasonableness consists in fair and equal treatment of each other. And that captures all the interesting asymmetries we find in tort law. And it's, or you'll find consequentialists saying, no, but the law is concerned with equal treatment of people regardless of their motives. And so there are numerous foundational attempts, to say this is the moral theory that serves as the foundation of negligence, but also in turn, I think, of what reasonableness consists in. What I want to focus on right now, click to add title. Let's wait on that too. Wait on that for a second. There's a kind of non-codifiability of reasonableness that within the tort law is a good feature. It allows us to be flexible in light of the fact that our practical interests are very, very different. Okay. If I accidentally, who do I want to pick on? Carl. I accidentally, jam his finger this afternoon, and he can't use it anymore. And I feel bad, and his ability to type his next paper is impeded, and it was my fault, right? And that I was perhaps negligent when I did it. Let's suppose. His interest in having a working, ring finger on his right hand, fairly significant, but not really different from most of us, right? But if he's a concert pianist, right, or he plays the classical guitar, his interest in having a working right hand, ring finger, much greater, right? This is the way humans are. Our interests in certain things vary. Now, Aristotle says, that the law makes leveling assumptions. It assumes everyone's interests are more or less the same. But there's something unjust about that. Well, the reasonable person standard lets us be a little more flexible and not make these leveling assumptions. That's one nice feature. It lets us think, well, in this case, you should have realized he was carrying a guitar case, for heaven's sake. When you jammed his finger, reasonable foresight would have told you that it might matter a lot to be more careful around his fingers, right? So, no, the invocation of the reasonable person standard allows this kind of flexibility with respect to interests. And it's sort of counter to the leveling assumptions of the law. Neil McCormick suggests another nice feature about the use of the reasonable person standard in the law with respect to codifiability and pushbacks against codifiability. He says legal standards typically embody a relatively specific subset of social values, right? And one would be inclined to concur for values like fairness, due care, due process, natural justice, or the like. But in the case of reasonable, there's not the same degree of localization of values. What's reasonable in the particular circumstances depends on an evaluating of competing factors of decision. So you don't just look, when you're making a decision about whether something was reasonable behavior, you don't just look at, well, reasonable in light of a specific value that you've already articulated. You get to bring to bear on the question, in the circumstances, all the different values that might be there that you couldn't have even predicted in advance. Gee, I never thought about the value before I undertook this behavior that you attach to having a working ring finger. But now that I see it, I can judge whether it would be reasonable to pursue this course of action or that one, okay? So there's this idea that already implicit in this, that the reasonable person can weigh values without knowing in advance what those values might be. You can throw any values at the reasonable person and they're going to be ready to hear what they are, ready to be responsive to them. And they won't say, oh, sorry, yeah, I'm only really prepared to consider, social values of these kinds, X, Y, Z. Okay. John Gardner. I want to focus on John Gardner's understanding of what the reasonable person standard consists in, because I think it's fascinating. Gardner is well aware of all these efforts to articulate what reasonableness is in Kantian terms or consequentialist terms or what have you. But he thinks that because of the flexibility that the standard is supposed to produce and the ability to weigh competing values of God knows what stripe, that it argues against any particular moral theory as grounds, any particular moral understanding of the reasonable person. And he says, the reasonable person does not embody, nor does he fail to accommodate, the he is maybe from that. The reasonable person does not embody, nor does he fail to accommodate any particular account of which reasons there are, or of how and when they come to be defeated or undefeated by each other. He does not stand for one justificatory standard rather than another, or for one type of justificatory standard rather than another. He's neither a value pluralist nor a value monist, neither consequentialist nor non-consequentialist, neither actualist nor probabilist about reasons, neither Kantian nor Benthamite. He stands only for justification tout court. Okay, the reasonable person is the justified person. That's it. I'm not going to tell you more. Well, in an earlier paper he did say a little bit more. He said the justified person is the person who acts for undefeated reasons. But then he doesn't say more about what undefeated reasons are. So it all still sort of terminates in this fairly, justified. You have undefeated reasons. Now, I find this position really fascinating. The argument, it isn't entirely clear to me, and I still don't have a good reconstruction of it, but the argument is that we invoke this standard, roughly, hand-wavy way, we invoke a reasonable person standard precisely because we want to gain for ourselves the flexibility, the non-codifiability in the law that it provides, right? We need that flexibility to take, to push back against the leveling assumptions of the law, right? We need it in order to be able to account for numerous, a plenum of values, right? And as a result, we can't give content to the standard, the reasonable person standard, by picking one particular favored moral theory and saying, oh, the reasonable person will care about consequences. The reasonable person will care about equality of outcome. Right? Because there will come a case where the reasonable person sets that particular thing aside because other values overwhelm equality of outcome, say, or what have you. Okay? So that's roughly the argument, I think, that moves Gardner. And it's a fascinating idea. I think it leads to a dilemma, an important one. And I think Gardner is somewhat sensitive to this dilemma. If you go for what Gardner calls the open reasonable person standard, you don't give it any content, you just say, yeah, a reasonable person is justified, acts for undefeated reasons, then it creates a kind of legal uncertainty. Okay. What do you say as a lawyer to your client about whether they should undertake this action or that action? Well, you're going to be judged, of course, in the courtroom by a reasonable person standard. And your client says, well, what will that entail? What will the juror then hold me responsible for? Well, whether you're justified or not. Okay, well, what does that entail? Am I justified here? Well, it sort of depends, doesn't it? On what? We don't say more. Well, now this is a situation lawyers hate. They can't advise their client. Clients aren't too happy either. This is how the law works, though. It does generate legal uncertainty. As a theorist, however, I think, regardless of how the law works, a theorist can rightly say, ooh, that looks troubling. Perhaps there shouldn't be an open standard here at all. But look, if we give a substantive standard instead, we choose our favorite moral theory, then we end up with the inflexibility and the problems of codification that H.L. Hart pointed out. You can't codify certain things. So this is the dilemma we're stuck with. Gardner himself says, yeah, there's just a tension in legal thinking and in legal practice. And this is why you'll find judges sort of on the side trying to suggest to the jury what's really relevant in this matter. But they don't want to go on record saying exactly what's relevant in the matter because whatever they say could become part of standing law, and then we get a more substantive characterization of the standard and the problems there. So there's always this tension, Gardner thinks, that jurists will face. They'll want to flesh out the standard, they'll feel it's wrong to do so. And that's just where we're left. Other legal theorists are more sanguine about this, and they say, no, look, we can understand what the open standard comes to. Neil McCormick, who has a book, Rhetoric and the Law, which I also recommend, it's a fascinating book, says, look, it's not so bad, this dilemma, leaving things somewhat open. There are legal uncertainties. The law only makes things so plain. But legal reasoning is just a special case of practical reasoning, and we can all do that. Right? So I guess what you're supposed to imagine then is that as a lawyer advising a client, you just say, well, use your own judgment to your client, and your judgment is more or less going to overlap with the juror's judgment, because it's all just practical reasoning. We can all do that. Kent Greenewalt says, well, he says a similar thing, only he states it in a sort of linguistic mode. Legal language is a special kind of ordinary, just talk, This is actually, I think, provably false, but, and we all understand each other. So, again, an appeal to ordinary practical reason or ordinary practice is what a lot of legal theorists I found will produce at this point to sort of dilute the tension one feels over leaving the standard somewhat determined. For my purposes, I'm in trouble, though. I can't just say that, right? Because remember, what I'm trying to do is ultimately I'm trying to say, hey, here's how knowledge claims work. When you claim to know that there's a strike on, airport workers are having a strike today, I claim to know that on the strength of what? I read it on a travel alert this morning. Pretty good evidence. When I do that, as a theorist, I'm looking at that kind of practice and I'm saying, why is that enough evidence, right? Well, because I met the reasonable person standard. Okay, yeah, well, but what does that involve? Well, it involves I don't know, I've got all these worries now. Does it involve does it yield the appropriate kind of determinacy so that you can know whether my claim is true or not and so forth? I've got worries about the determinacy of ordinary language knowledge claims. So I can't very well satisfy you by saying, but don't worry about that determinacy because we understand each other, right? I mean, so I'm not in a position to follow, I think, either McCormick or Greenewalt and just saying, it's okay, it all comes out in the end, we understand each other. Yeah, that's just a Greenewalt. Okay, so what do we do at this point? Well, I suggest we've got this concept of the reasonable person, which embeds the concept of the reasonable or reasonableness or whatever, reasonable. And what we're faced with is this really messy hermeneutical problem. It's clearly a concept that gets used in our practice all the time. If you and I are palling around through the conference and it's our third night together and you still want to go out for pizza, and I'm like, I've acquiesced a couple times now, but it's time to move on from pizza. And you're like, no, come on, pizza. Third night, right? I'm like, I'm really tired of pizza. Well, I think it's the best, you say. It's like, okay, but you're being unreasonable, right? That's a term we use all the time. We criticize each other for being unreasonable. We don't want to be unreasonable. Oh my God, we do not want to be unreasonable. We might not want to be too reasonable either. Sometimes I once had a roommate who said I was too reasonable, and I couldn't figure out why I felt so bad, but also so ready to defend myself. So, okay, so it's a concept that gets used a lot. So we'll have a ton of data, too much data. This is the problem we face as humanists: too much data, not enough theory. What do we do? And so, I didn't put this into the paper, but my move now is to suggest a methodology. And the methodological approach I'm inclined to take is the ordinary language philosopher's approach. And I'm writing now some stuff to try to make sure that people understand what that is. It is by no means a silly or dead approach to doing philosophy. Austin and H.P. Grice, too, both advocate this idea. When you face a really tough interpretive problem, you want to know what the content of this difficult concept is, then you have to throw everything you have at it. And I like that approach. Throw everything you have at it. So yeah, you do linguistic theory, you take surveys, linguistic phenomenology, right, is what you do. And then you also invoke relevant sciences. I can talk more in the Q&A about what I think the relevant sciences here might be that would tell us about what the content of the concept of reasonableness is. And what you do is you start building up some hypotheses and you test them against that data. This doesn't sound crazy, right? So in the paper that Corey read, actually, I did articulate a few hypotheses that I think would be worth thinking about. And I just want to go through them briefly now. And I'm almost done. The concept reasonable person is a product of our classificatory practices. This should not be surprising. It's a concept. So in a way, this part is trivial. Concepts are products of our classificatory practices. But here comes the meat of it. The concept reasonable person refers to a social kind. Okay. It's a social kind concept. It's not a natural kind concept like water. It's the concept of a kind that gets put in place by our social practices. The social kind put in place by the concept, reasonable person, is constructed around a role or set of roles played by individuals in social relations to each other. Which roles? Well, that'll be the thing we start to investigate then. The social kind reasonable person is a real category, a genuine kind. It's not a fictitious kind like satanic ritual abuse or something. I mean, it's, there's a real category there. It's more like landlord. You can step into that role, you can step out of it. There are rules for being it. It involves, basic ways of interacting with each other. There are perhaps conventions around it. And these various social roles that constitute the social kind give rise to normative role ideals. As Sally Haslinger's work here is really helpful and relevant, right? She talks about how, you know, there's a social kind, there's a social concept, woman or man, right? And it generates a social role ideal, right? There's a way that you should act as a man in certain societies, right? So these ideals get generated from these roles. Well, I think the reasonable person standard is just a social role ideal generated from the social kind, or the social concept, reasonable person. So what we're really going to have to investigate is, what distinctive social roles do people play that we want to mark out and say, yeah, right there you were being a reasonable person, pat on the head, right? What does that role involve? And Haslinger goes on to suggest, and I think this is really interesting too, that, you know, we'll give a kind of functional role analysis to what these roles are, right? Picking that person out and patting them on the head, saying, you were reasonable there, what you just did, that role you took up, that was good, right? That has value for us. That's a valuable thing for us to do, otherwise we wouldn't be doing it. What's the value there that gets promoted? What kinds of values get promoted will tell us more about what that role is, and they will also tell us in turn about the ideal of the reasonable person. I also think it's a fascinating framework because Ian Hacking suggests that with social kind concepts you get what he calls looping effects. Okay? What's the looping effect? Well, in the distinctive case of some social kind concepts, when we classify people and we say, you're a reasonable person, right? That affects the person's thoughts and actions. Now we've got a dynamic going on, because the person says, I don't want to be reasonable, or I do want to be reasonable, right? So they will start to act either more toward being reasonable or less, right? They'll actually maybe question the categorization. Why'd you call me reasonable? What is it that you're talking about here? Well, I don't think that's what reasonable is. Oh my God, so this is, it's not like calling a bit of the world gold or water, right? Which they're totally inert, they don't fight back. You call someone reasonable, things can get messy. Okay, so these looping effects, I think it's going to be very interesting to apply that idea, because I think it'll allow us to make sense of the evolution of the concept of reasonableness across time as we develop a richer sense of what's at stake in being reasonable. Right? All these different moral theories are helping us to articulate different conceptions of what's at stake in being reasonable. And as we become more aware of them and reflect on them, our concept of being reasonable can change and evolve. Okay? And I think the looping effect is going to be a really important thing to understand about the concept of reasonableness. So some of this talk is about what the concept of reasonableness even might be. It's a very high level kind of talk. I'm not telling you much about the substance. I am inclined to put, as part of my framework, start out with Gardner's assumption that reasonable means justified. Punkt. Period. And see how far we can get making sense of the data that way. I'm actually doing a lot of online reading at this point. You know, all these discussion blogs. Am I being unreasonable? You would not believe how many people write into these things and wonder whether they're being unreasonable or not. And they have cases and counterexamples, and they talk it over with each other. And so, you know, I think you can look at those and see, are they just using a notion of justified or not, right? And that's a little bit of what, you know, Austin, I think, if Austin were alive, he'd be all over the internet, I think. It's a little bit what he suggests we should do, right? So that's a little taste of what the methodology is that I'm hoping to pursue, and I've just begun this kind of large project. And so I'd be eager to hear what you have to say.